I remember the sound more than anything else. The way the floorboards groaned under his weight, a slow creak that cut through the darkness like a confession. I had been lying there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old fan labor against the summer heat. The blades wobbled slightly with each rotation, casting shifting shadows across the room in the pale light that filtered through my blinds. My apartment had always been quiet. Too quiet, some would say. I preferred it that way. Everything in its place, nothing unexpected, nothing that couldn't be controlled or planned for. The kind of silence that wrapped around you like a cocoon, predictable and safe. But that night, the silence felt different, heavier, like it was waiting for something to happen. I heard him shift on the floor beside my bed, the rustle of the thin blanket I had given him. He had insisted he would be fine down there. "Don't worry, I've crashed in worse places," he had said with that easy grin of his, the one that made you believe everything would work out even when logic suggested otherwise. Nolan had a way of making the impossible seem reasonable, of turning my carefully ordered world just slightly off its axis without me even noticing until it was too late. The floor creaked again, and I felt my chest tighten. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, tracing the familiar water stain near the corner that I kept meaning to paint over, but never did. My heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, each pulse echoing in my ears like a drum. I tried to breathe evenly to maintain the illusion of sleep, but every muscle in my body was taut with awareness. Then I saw him, a shadow at the edge of my vision, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to wake a sleeping person. Nolan stood at the foot of my bed, the blanket bundled in his arms like an offering. The pale light from the window caught the outline of his face, and I could see he was looking at me, studying me. I forced myself to keep my breathing steady, my eyes half closed, but I felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see right through my pretense. He stood there for a long moment, and I wonder what he was thinking. Whether he was weighing options, calculating risks, or simply gathering the courage to do what he had come to do. Nolan was impulsive by nature, the kind of person who acted first and thought later, but this felt different, deliberate, intentional. The mattress dipped under his weight as he climbed onto the bed, and my entire body went rigid. The movement was slow, careful, as if he was afraid the bed might collapse beneath us both. I felt the shift in the sheets, the way they pulled slightly as he settled beside me, leaving what felt like acres of space between us, but somehow managing to make the bed feel impossibly small at the same time. He said nothing. Neither did I. We lay there in the darkness, two bodies occupying the same space, but existing in entirely different worlds. I could hear his breathing, slightly uneven, matching the rhythm of my own racing heart. The fan continued its labored rotation overhead, the only constant in a moment that felt like it might splinter apart at any second. I had known Nolan for 3 years. 3 years of late-night conversations and shared meals, and the kind of friendship that develops slowly, like a photograph emerging in a darkroom. He was everything I was not. Where I was methodical, he was spontaneous. Where I was cautious, he was fearless. Where I planned every detail of my life with scientific precision, he seemed to navigate the world by instinct alone, trusting that things would work out simply because they had to. But lying there beside him, I realized I had been fooling myself. All those moments when I had attributed his behavior to simple friendship, when I had explained away the lingering looks and casual touches as meaningless gestures, when I had convinced myself that the way my pulse quickened when he entered a room was nothing more than platonic affection. I had built an elaborate architecture of denial, and now it was crumbling around me with each breath he took. The space between us felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. I could sense the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something else, something uniquely him that I had never been able to identify, but had come to associate with safety, with home. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. I wanted to say something to break the tension that was building between us like water behind a dam. But what words could possibly capture this moment, this shift from friendship into something unnamed and uncharted? What language existed for the space between what we had been and what we might become? So I said nothing. I lay there in the darkness, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every breath. The fan wobbled overhead, the floorboards settled in the cooling night air, and somewhere in the distance, a car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping briefly across my ceiling before disappearing again into the night. Nolan shifted slightly, and I felt the mattress respond to his movement. My body remained frozen, caught between the desire to turn toward him and the fear of what that might mean, what it might set in motion. This was uncharted territory for me, a deviation from the careful path I had laid out for my life. I was 21 years old, a biology major with a 5-year plan and a clear vision of my future. I studied systems and structures, the predictable patterns of life that could be observed and documented and understood. But this felt like stepping off the edge of the known world into something wild and unmappable. This felt like free fall. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and weighted with all the things we were not saying. I found myself cataloging every detail of the moment, as if I could preserve it somehow, hold it in amber like the specimens I studied in lab. The way the shadows moved across the walls, the particular quality of the darkness, the rhythm of our breathing as it slowly began to synchronize despite our efforts to remain separate. I thought about all the nights Nolan had crashed on my couch or floor, all the times he had shown up unannounced at my door with some excuse or another, some reason why he couldn't go back to his own place. I had always assumed it was convenience, or maybe a desire to avoid his roommates, or simply the kind of casual intimacy that develops between close friends. But lying there in the dark, I began to wonder if there had been something else all along, some pull neither of us had been willing to acknowledge until now. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my heart race even faster. This was not an accident. This was not impulse or convenience or the simple logistics of sleeping arrangements. This was choice. This was Nolan choosing to climb into my bed, choosing to lie beside me in the darkness, choosing to cross a line we had both been dancing around for longer than either of us cared to admit. And somehow, impossibly, I was choosing it too. I had never been the kind of person who left things to chance. Even as a child, I arranged my toys in perfect rows, sorted my crayons by color, finished my homework the day it was assigned. My mother used to joke that I came out of the womb with a schedule, but it was never really a joke to me. Order was safety. Predictability was peace. My apartment reflected this need for control in every corner. The books on my shelves were arranged first by subject, then alphabetically by author. My kitchen cabinets contained rows of matching containers, each labeled in my careful handwriting. Even my closet followed a system, shirts grouped by color, pants hung with military precision, shoes lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. It was a space designed for one person who knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. Nolan had always been chaos incarnate in comparison. The first time I met him, freshman year, he was sprawled across his unmade dorm bed eating cereal from a coffee mug because he had forgotten to unpack his bowls. His side of the room looked like a tornado had touched down, clothes draped over every surface, textbooks stacked in precarious towers, guitar picks scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. I'd stare at the mess with something approaching horror, already mentally calculating how I might construct a wall down the center of our shared space. But Nolan had looked up from his cereal with those warm brown eyes and grinned. "Hey, roomie," he had said, as if we were old friends reuniting after years apart. I had mumbled something polite in response, but inside I was already planning my transfer request. I never submitted that request. Somehow, over the course of that first semester, Nolan's chaos became familiar rather than threatening. His laughter-filled spaces I had not realized were empty. His impulsiveness pulled me into adventures I would never have chosen for myself, but found I needed more than I had known. When he changed his major from business to art to psychology to philosophy, I stopped trying to understand his logic and simply accepted it as part of who he was. By our sophomore year, when we moved into separate apartments, I found myself missing the mess. My perfectly ordered space felt hollow without his scattered presence. He began showing up at my door with increasing frequency, armed with takeout containers and stories for whatever part-time job he was trying that week. He delivered pizza for exactly 3 weeks before deciding the uniform made him look like a circus performer. He lasted a month at a bookstore before getting fired for reading on the job. He tried tutoring high school students in math, but quit after 2 sessions because, as he put it, teenagers are just tiny sociopaths with hormones. Each failure came with a story, told with the kind of self-deprecating humor that made you forget these were supposed to be disappointments. Nolan had a gift for transforming disaster into entertainment, for finding light in situations that would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and replanning. He never seemed to worry about the future the way I did, never lay awake calculating the probable outcomes of his choices. I envied that quality in him, even as it frustrated me. How could someone live so entirely in the present? How could he make decisions based on feeling rather than logic? I was a biology major precisely because I loved the certainty of scientific method, hypothesis, experimentation, conclusion. Life could be understood if you applied the right framework, followed the correct procedures. But Nolan operated outside any framework I could identify. He was all intuition and impulse, trusting in something I could not measure or quantify. He showed up when people needed him, even when they had not asked. He remembered the small details that mattered, how I liked my coffee, which professors made me anxious, the fact that I got quiet when I was overwhelmed rather than talkative like most people. That was perhaps what drew me to him most powerfully. In a world where I often felt like I was performing a version of myself that others could understand, Nolan saw through the performance to something more essential. He never pushed me to be more social or spontaneous, never tried to fix what he perceived as my limitations. Instead, he seemed to appreciate the qualities others found strange or difficult. When I organized his scattered notes into neat piles, he thanked me genuinely rather than taking offense. When I made detailed lists for group projects we worked on together, he followed them without complaint. When I needed silence to study, he could sit in my living room for hours, reading or sketching, his presence comforting rather than intrusive. Our friendship had developed its own ecosystem over the years, a delicate balance between his chaos and my order. We complemented each other in ways that made no logical sense, but felt as natural as breathing. He brought spontaneity to my carefully planned world. I provided stability to his constantly shifting landscape. But lying there in the darkness beside him, I realized how carefully I had been managing even this relationship. How I had filed away the moments when his hand lingered on my shoulder, when his eyes held mine a beat too long, when the space between us hummed with something unnamed. I had categorized these incidents as friendship, explained them away with the same methodical precision I applied to everything else in my life. Now, with the weight of his body beside me in my bed, all those careful explanations felt like elaborate self-deception. The evidence had been there all along. I had simply chosen not to see it, not to acknowledge what it might mean for the orderly life I had constructed. Nolan shifted slightly, and I heard him swallow in the darkness. Neither of us had moved closer, but neither had moved away. We existed in this strange, suspended state, acknowledging without words that something fundamental had changed between us. The careful boundaries of our friendship had dissolved the moment he climbed onto my mattress, and now we were in uncharted territory together. It started 3 hours earlier with the sound of someone pounding on my apartment door. Not knocking, pounding. The kind of urgent rhythm that suggested emergency or desperation or both. I had been reviewing notes for my molecular biology exam when the noise shattered the careful quiet of my evening routine. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, assuming whoever it was had the wrong apartment. But the pounding continued, insistent and somehow familiar. When I opened the door, Nolan was leaning against the frame with the loose-limbed posture of someone who had been drinking but was trying very hard to appear sober. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there was something in his eyes I could not quite identify. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of restless energy that seemed to be eating at him from the inside. "Hey," he said, as if showing up at my door at nearly midnight was the most natural thing in the world. His voice carried the careful precision of someone monitoring their own speech for signs of intoxication. "Thought I'd crash here tonight." I stepped back to let him in, taking inventory of his condition as he moved past me into my living room. He was not falling down drunk, but he was definitely not sober either. There was a looseness to his movements, a slight delay between thought and action that I had learned to recognize over the years of our friendship. He had been at another party, I realized. The kind of loud, crowded gatherings that left him energized and depleted in equal measure. "Where were you?" I asked, closing the door behind him and turning the deadbolt out of habit. The metallic click echoed in the sudden quiet of my apartment. "Some house off campus," he said, collapsing onto my couch without invitation. He ran both hands through his hair, leaving it standing at odd angles. "You know the kind. Too much beer, too loud music, too many people pretending they're having more fun than they actually are." I did not know the kind, actually. My idea of a good evening involved precisely what I had been doing before his arrival. Quiet study, organized notes, the satisfaction of crossing completed tasks off carefully constructed lists. But I had heard enough of Nolan's party stories over the years to understand the particular brand of social exhaustion he was describing. "Why didn't you just go home?" I asked, settling into my armchair and trying to read his mood. It was a genuine question, not an accusation. Nolan's apartment was only 6 blocks away, an easy walk even in his current condition. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up at me, something in his expression made my chest tighten. "I didn't want to be alone," he said simply. The honesty of it caught me off guard. I offered him the couch, as I always did when he showed up unannounced. It had become our established pattern over the years. He would appear at my door with some excuse or crisis. I would provide temporary refuge, and by morning everything would return to normal. The couch was comfortable enough, I assured him, and I could grab him some blankets and a pillow from my bedroom. But when I returned with the bedding, Nolan was standing in my living room, surveying the chaos of my displaced laundry. I had been folding clothes earlier and had piled everything on the couch cushions in neat, categorized stacks. Shirts in one pile, pants in another, underwear and socks arranged with the same methodical precision I applied to everything else in my life. "This looks like a textile archaeological dig," he said, poking at one of the stacks with obvious amusement. "How am I supposed to sleep on this monument to your obsessive-compulsive tendencies?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I had been so focused on my studying that I had completely forgotten about the laundry situation. "Just move it to the floor," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew how that would end. My carefully sorted clothing would become a wrinkled disaster, and the thought made my skin crawl. Nolan seemed to sense my distress because he grinned and threw himself dramatically across the piles of clothing. "My back is killing me anyway," he announced to the ceiling. "This floor is going to destroy what's left of my spine. I'll probably wake up looking like a question mark." Despite my irritation about the laundry, I found myself smiling. Nolan had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to defuse tension with humor. It was one of the things I appreciated most about him, even when I was the target of his gentle mockery. "Fine," I said, gathering up my clothes and depositing them in a basket to deal with later. "But I'm not listening to you complain about being uncomfortable all night." I retrieved a blanket from the hall closet and spread it on the floor beside my bed. It was not ideal, but it was better than the couch situation. Nolan examined the makeshift sleeping arrangement with the serious consideration of someone evaluating real estate. "You know what?" he said, settling onto the blanket with exaggerated care. "I've definitely crashed in worse places. Remember that time sophomore year when I passed out in the library and woke up with a book indent on my face?" I remembered. I also remembered being the one to find him there at 6 in the morning, drooling on a copy of Chaucer. But that seemed like a lifetime ago now, back when our friendship existed within clearly defined boundaries, when the most complicated thing between us was his tendency to borrow my textbooks and return them with coffee stains. I turned off the lights and climbed into my bed, hyper-aware of his presence on the floor below. The apartment settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, but sleep felt impossible. I could hear Nolan shifting on the thin blanket, adjusting position, trying to find comfort on the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous," he muttered after several minutes of restless movement. "Go to sleep," I told him, but my voice lacked conviction. I was wide awake too, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound he made. The floor creaked as he moved again and then again. Each sound seemed amplified in the darkness, a reminder of his presence just feet away from where I lay. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the familiar rhythm of the ceiling fan, on anything other than the growing awareness that something was different about this night. When I heard him stand up, my entire body tensed. The soft rustle of fabric told me he was gathering the blanket. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady, pretending to sleep even as my heart began to race. The mattress dipped under his weight, and everything changed. The next morning, neither of us acknowledged what had happened. I woke to find Nolan already dressed, standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee in his hands, as if he had materialized there by magic. The blanket from the floor was folded neatly on my couch, a small gesture that felt both thoughtful and somehow pointed. He looked up when I emerged from my bedroom, offering me that familiar, easy grin that could disarm any awkwardness. "Sleep like a baby," he announced, taking a long sip of his coffee. "Thanks for letting me crash. Your floor is surprisingly comfortable." My floor. As if that was where he had spent the night. As if I had imagined the weight of his body settling beside me in the dark. The careful space he had maintained between us. The way my entire nervous system had hummed with awareness of his presence until dawn finally crept through my blinds. I stared at him, searching his face for some sign that he remembered, that he felt the shift I was certain had occurred between us. But Nolan's expression revealed nothing beyond casual gratitude and the slight sheepishness that always followed his unplanned visits. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug in my sink with the consideration of someone who understood the rules of temporary hospitality, and gathered his things. By the time he left, I had almost convinced myself I had dreamed the entire thing. Almost. He returned 2 nights later with a different excuse. His roommate was having people over, and the noise was impossible to study through. This time I did not even bother offering the couch. I spread the blanket on the floor beside my bed without comment, and we settled into what felt like a rehearsed routine. Lights out, casual goodnight, the pretense that this was purely practical. But when the apartment grew quiet and I thought he was asleep, I heard the familiar creak of floorboards. The mattress dipped as he climbed up beside me, and once again we lay in the darkness, maintaining the fiction that this was normal, that friends shared beds all the time without it meaning anything beyond convenience. This second night, he lay closer, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could hear the subtle changes in his breathing as he settled into sleep. I remained rigid beside him, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever spell we were both pretending did not exist. "You're like sleeping next to a board," he murmured into the darkness, his voice thick with approaching sleep. "Seriously, Gal, do you even have joints, or are you just one solid piece of anxiety held together by willpower?" I forced a laugh, trying to inject some lightness into my voice. "Sorry, I'm not used to sharing." "It's fine," he said, and I felt rather than saw him turn toward me slightly. You don't have to be so careful. I'm not going to break." But that was exactly what I was afraid of. Not that he would break, but that I would. That this careful balance we had maintained for 3 years would collapse under the weight of whatever was happening between us in these quiet hours after midnight. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Nolan would appear at my door with increasingly transparent excuses. His apartment was too hot, too cold, too loud, too quiet. His back hurt from his mattress. His roommate was being weird. He needed a change of scenery to study effectively. Each reason more ridiculous than the last, and each one delivered with the straight-faced conviction of someone who believed his own performance. I never questioned these explanations, never pointed out the obvious holes in his logic. Instead, I found myself looking forward to the sound of his knock on my door, to the disruption of my carefully ordered evenings. I began keeping extra blankets clean and ready, stocking my kitchen with the kind of snacks he preferred, making space in my routine for his chaotic presence. But it was the nights that became the center of everything. Each time, he would start on the floor with his blanket, maintaining the pretense that this was where he belonged. And each time, after I turned off the lights and we exchanged our carefully casual goodnights, he would wait. I learned to recognize the exact moment when he would move, the particular quality of silence that preceded the creak of floorboards and the dip of my mattress. He grew bolder in small increments. The first few nights, he maintained careful distance, lying on his back with his arms folded across his chest like he was practicing for his own funeral. But gradually, the space between us diminished. A shoulder would brush against mine as he shifted in his sleep. His knee would nudge against my thigh when he rolled over. His hand would fall open beside mine on the narrow expanse of sheet between us, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his palm without actually touching. I became hyper-attuned to every movement, every breath, every subtle shift in the geography of my bed. Sleep became secondary to the exquisite torture of lying beside him, measuring the distance between us in millimeters, cataloging each point where our bodies almost but never quite made contact. During the days, we maintained perfect normalcy. We studied together in the library, grabbed coffee between classes, argued about movies and music with the easy familiarity of long friendship. Nolan showed no sign that our nights were anything other than practical arrangements, convenient solutions to temporary housing problems. But I caught him watching me sometimes when he thought I was not looking. His gaze would linger on my face with an intensity one had never noticed before, or perhaps had noticed and filed away as unimportant. Now, every glance felt weighted with possibility, every casual touch electric with potential meaning. What terrified me most was not knowing which version of reality was true. Was I projecting significance onto meaningless coincidence? Was I so desperate for connection that I was imagining intimacy where none existed? Or was Nolan as aware as I was of the careful game we were playing, the slow dance around something neither of us dared name? The uncertainty was eating at me from the inside, transforming my ordered world into something unstable and unpredictable. But even as it terrified me, I could not bring myself to break the pattern. Each night when he appeared at my door, I let him in. Each time he climbed into my bed, I made room for him in the darkness. It was a Thursday night in late October when everything changed. I remember the date because I had been studying for my organic chemistry midterm, my notes spread across my desk in the methodical way that usually brought me comfort. But I had read the same page 3 times without absorbing a single word, my mind spinning with calculations that had nothing to do with molecular structures and everything to do with the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Nolan had been coming over every night for 2 weeks straight. His excuses had become so thin they were barely excuses at all anymore, just fragments of explanation delivered with a sheepish smile that acknowledged the pretense without abandoning it entirely. The night before, he had simply said his place felt weird, as if that explained anything. I had not asked for clarification, and he had not offered any. When he finally knocked, I felt the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with dread that had become the soundtrack to my evenings. But when I opened the door, something was different. He was not carrying his usual overnight bag, and there was an intensity in his eyes that made me step back instinctively. He moved past me into my living room with purpose, then stopped in the center of the space as if he had forgotten why he had come. For a long moment, we stood there looking at each other, and I felt the weight of all our unspoken nights pressing against the carefully constructed walls of our friendship. "This is getting ridiculous," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. The words hung in the air between us like a confession. I did not pretend to misunderstand him. We both knew what he was talking about, even though we had never acknowledged it directly. The careful choreography of our nights, the pretense that his presence in my bed was accidental, coincidental, meaningless. The way we both lay rigid in the darkness, hyper-aware of every breath, every movement, every millimeter of space between us. "I know," I said, and was surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me felt like it was trembling. He ran both hands through his hair, a gesture I had learned to recognize as his way of buying time when he was struggling to find words. "Do you ever think about how weird this is?" he asked, and then immediately shook his head as if the question was not quite right. "Not weird. That's not what I mean." He moved to my couch and sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, staring at his hands. I remained standing by the door, afraid that if I moved closer, the fragile bubble of this moment might burst, and we would both retreat back into safer territory. "I mean," he continued, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it, "that I show up here every night with some stupid excuse, and you let me in. And then I lie on that floor for exactly 15 minutes before I climb into your bed like some kind of, I don't know what, like some kind of pathetic." He trailed off, shaking his head again. When he looked up at me, his eyes were bright with something that looked like frustration or maybe fear. "And you never say anything," he said. "You never ask me what I'm doing or why I keep coming here or what I think is going to happen. You just make room for me." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had been making room for him, in my bed and in my life, without ever demanding explanation or definition. I had been content to exist in the space between friendship and something else, afraid to name what we were doing because naming it would require choosing what came next. "What am I supposed to say?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. "What are you asking me to say?" He stood up from the couch and moved closer to me, close enough that I could see the conflict playing out across his features. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe I'm asking you to tell me to stop. To tell me that this is crazy and I should go home to my own bed and leave you alone." But that was the last thing I wanted, and we both knew it. The thought of returning to my old routine, of lying alone in my bed without the warm presence of his body beside me, felt like losing something essential I had not realized I needed until I had it. "Or maybe," he continued, stepping even closer, "maybe I'm asking you to tell me that it's not just me. That you feel it too, whatever this is." My chest felt tight, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I could smell his cologne, could see the slight tremor in his hands that suggested he was not as calm as he was trying to appear. We stood there looking at each other, and I felt like we were standing at the edge of a cliff, both afraid to jump and afraid to step back. "I feel it," I said finally, the words barely audible even in the quiet of my apartment. "Whatever this is, I feel it too." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of relief mixed with terror. He reached up and touched my face with gentle fingers, the first time he had touched me deliberately, intentionally since this whole thing had started. "You scare the hell out of me," he whispered, his thumb tracing along my cheekbone. "This scares the hell out of me." "Me too," I managed to say, though my voice was barely working anymore. He stepped closer still, until there was almost no space left between us, until I could feel his breath against my face. "It's not just the bed," he said, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. "It's not just having somewhere to sleep." I knew what he was trying to tell me, could see it in his eyes even before he found the words. "It's you," he said finally. "It's being close to you. It's the way you make everything feel. I don't know. Safe, I guess. Like I can stop running for a while." The honesty of it broke something open inside me, some carefully constructed dam that had been holding back weeks of accumulated feeling. All those nights of careful distance, of measured breathing, of pretending that proximity was accidental rather than essential. "Nolan," I started to say, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything," he told me. "I just needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud at least once, even if it changes everything." The silence that followed his confession felt different from all the silences we had shared before. Not the careful quiet of avoidance, but something heavier and more fragile, like the moment before thunder when the entire world holds its breath. I stood there with his hand still touching my face, feeling the weight of his words settle between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we were ready to cross. Part of me wanted to retreat, to laugh it off and pretend this was just another late-night conversation that would seem less significant in the harsh light of morning. I had built my entire life around predictability, around knowing what came next and how to prepare for it. This felt like standing at the edge of an ocean with no map, no compass, no way to measure the depth of what we were about to enter. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw my own fear reflected back, multiplied by vulnerability I had never seen him display before. Nolan, who approached everything with casual confidence, who made decisions based on instinct and never seemed to doubt the wisdom of his choices, was terrified. His hand trembled slightly against my cheek, and I realized that admitting his feelings had cost him something, had required a kind of courage I was not sure I possessed. I could have said nothing. I could have let the moment pass and allowed us both to retreat to safer ground. But something in his expression stopped me, some desperate hope that he was trying very hard to hide behind his usual easy demeanor. Instead of speaking, I did something that surprised us both. I leaned forward, closing the small distance between us until my forehead touched his. It was barely contact, just the lightest possible acknowledgement of what he had offered me, but it felt monumental. His eyes widened slightly, and I heard his breath catch. We stood like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, sharing the same air, existing in a space that was neither friendship nor whatever came next, but something entirely new. I could feel his pulse where his fingers rested against my jaw, could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes that I had never noticed during all our casual conversations. "This changes things," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, and his voice was just as quiet. "Are you okay with that?" It was such a simple question, but it contained multitudes. Was I okay with admitting that our friendship had already changed, that it had been changing for weeks without either of us acknowledging it? Was I okay with stepping into territory neither of us had mapped, with no guarantee of where it might lead? Was I okay with wanting something I had never allowed myself to want before? "I don't know," I said, and the honesty of it felt like its own kind of revelation. "I don't know what this means, or where it goes, or how to do any of it, but I don't want you to leave." Something shifted in his expression, relief mixing with something deeper and more complex. He moved his thumb across my cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. "You don't have to know," he said. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight." But even as he said it, I could feel the impossibility of going back to what we had been before. The careful pretense of accidental intimacy, the elaborate fiction that our nights meant nothing more than friendship and convenience. We had crossed some invisible line, and there was no returning to the other side. My legs felt unsteady, and without discussing it, we moved together toward my bedroom. Not with urgency or passion, but with the careful deliberation of people approaching something sacred. When we reached my bed, we both stopped, looking down at the space that had become the center of our unspoken dance. "No more pretending about the floor," Nolan said, and there was something almost sad in his voice, as if he was mourning the loss of our elaborate charade, even as he was relieved to abandon it. "No more pretending," I agreed. We climbed onto the bed together, but differently than all the nights before. No careful measurement of distance, no rigid positioning designed to maintain the illusion of accident. Instead, we lay on our sides facing each other, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could count his eyelashes in the dim light filtering through my blinds. For a long time, neither of us moved. We simply looked at each other, taking in this new version of intimacy that felt both familiar and completely foreign. All those nights of lying beside each other in careful silence, and now we were finally, truly seeing each other. "I'm scared," I said, because it felt important to name it. "Me too," he replied, and then added, "but I'm more scared of pretending this isn't happening." I understood what he meant. The pretense had become its own kind of prison, requiring more and more elaborate justification to maintain. At least this honest fear was clean, direct, something we could face together rather than something we had to carry alone. Slowly, carefully, he reached for my hand where it lay on the space of sheet between us. His fingers were warm as they interlaced with mine, and the simple contact sent electricity through my entire nervous system. Such a small gesture, but it felt like claiming something, like making a choice we could not unmake. "Whatever this is," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "whatever we are, I want to figure it out with you." I squeezed his hand, feeling the solid reality of his fingers against mine. It was not a promise exactly, but it was an agreement. a commitment to move forward together into uncertainty rather than apart into the familiar safety of what we had always known. The room hummed with the steady rhythm of the ceiling fan, the same sound that had been the backdrop to all our careful nights of pretending. But now it felt different, like a soundtrack to something beginning rather than something we were trying to avoid acknowledging. We fell asleep that way, hands joined in a narrow space between us, breathing synchronized in the darkness that no longer felt heavy with unspoken things but light with possibility. I woke before dawn, the way I always did, but this morning felt different from every other morning of my life. The room was still dark. The only light, a faint gray seepage around the edges of my blinds that suggested the world outside was beginning to stir. The ceiling fan continued its steady rotation overhead, the same rhythm that had become the soundtrack to all our careful nights of pretense. But now the sound felt different, familiar and new at the same time, like coming home to a place that had been quietly transforming while you were away. Nolan was still asleep beside me, his breathing deep, and even in a way that suggested he had found the kind of rest that had been eluding both of us for weeks. Our hands were still joined where they had fallen between us, his fingers warm and slightly damp with sleep. I lay there in the pre-dawn quiet, studying his face in the dim light and trying to process the magnitude of what had shifted between us in the space of a single evening. There had been no dramatic declarations, no passionate embraces, no cinematic moments that would translate easily into the stories people told about falling in love. Instead, there had been quiet honesty and careful touch, the simple acknowledgement of something that had been growing between us for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. It felt both monumental and utterly natural, like waking up to discover that the landscape outside your window had changed overnight, but in ways that made perfect sense when you really looked at them. I could feel the exact points where our bodies were connected, his hand in mine, his knee barely brushing against my thigh, the shared warmth that existed in the narrow space between us. Such small contacts, but they felt significant in a way that made my chest tight with something I could not quite name. Not anxiety exactly, but there was certainly that. More like the vertigo that comes from standing at a great height and realizing how far you have climbed without noticing. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up. I could hear the distant hum of early traffic, the occasional voice of someone heading to work or returning from a late night, the small sounds that marked the transition from night to day. But inside my apartment, we existed in a bubble of quiet that felt separate from the larger world, protected by the walls I had built around my carefully ordered life. Nolan stirred slightly in his sleep, and I felt his fingers tighten around mine in an unconscious gesture that sent warmth spreading through my entire body. Even sleeping, some part of him was aware of me, was choosing to hold on. The thought was both comforting and terrifying in its implications. What did this mean for us? The question hung in the air like morning mist, impossible to ignore but difficult to examine directly. We had crossed a line, acknowledged feelings that changed the fundamental nature of our relationship, but we had not discussed what came next. There had been no negotiations about labels or expectations, no planning for how we would navigate the shift from friendship to whatever this was. That lack of definition should have troubled me more than it did. I was someone who thrived on clarity, on knowing the parameters of any situation and how to operate within them. But lying there in the growing light, I found myself surprisingly at peace with the uncertainty. Maybe it was enough, for now, to simply exist in the space we had created, to let whatever we were becoming unfold naturally rather than trying to force it into categories I understood. I thought about all the nights that had led us to this moment. The careful choreography of pretended accidents, the elaborate justifications for proximity, the way we had both danced around something neither of us was quite ready to name. It seemed almost absurd now, all that energy spent maintaining the fiction that what was happening between us was purely platonic. But maybe we hadn't needed that time, that gradual approach to intimacy that allowed us both to adjust to the idea of being more than friends. The light in the room was growing stronger, and I knew that soon we would have to wake up fully and figure out how to exist in this new reality we had created. There would be conversations that needed to happen, boundaries that needed to be established or dissolved, decisions about how to move forward. But for now, in the quiet space between night and day, none of that felt urgent. Nolan's breathing changed slightly, and I knew he was beginning to wake up. I watched as awareness crept across his features, the small frown that appeared between his eyebrows as he registered his surroundings, the moment when his eyes opened and found mine already watching him. "Hi," he said softly, his voice thick with sleep. His thumb moved across my knuckles in a gesture that felt both automatic and intentional. "Hi," I replied, and was surprised by how normal my voice sounded when everything inside me felt rearranged. We lay there looking at each other in the growing daylight, and I could see my own wonder reflected in his eyes. This quiet intimacy, this simple closeness without pretense or explanation, felt like discovering a room in my own apartment that I had never known existed. "No regrets?" he asked quietly, and I could hear the vulnerability beneath the casual question. "No regrets," I confirmed, and meant it completely. The sun was rising now, painting the walls of my bedroom in shades of gold and amber. Outside, the world was fully awake, full of noise and movement and the complicated business of ordinary life. But inside, we remained still, hands joined in the space between us, breathing the same air, existing in a moment that felt both fragile and permanent. This was how love arrived, I realized, not with fanfare or dramatic gesture, but quietly, in the accumulated weight of small choices and careful touches. In the decision to make space for someone in your bed in your life, and the even more difficult decision to let them stay. The ceiling fan turned overhead, marking time in its steady rhythm, and we lay there together as the morning light grew stronger around us. Two people who had finally stopped pretending they were anything other than exactly what they had always been becoming.